Are you recently retired? Or are you currently planning on retiring maybe in the next year or two and wondering where you'd like to live? And a big question you might have is, do I want to rent something or do I want to buy something? And in this video, I'm going to take a deep dive into the questions that you need to ask yourself in order to make a good decision for you, because there's not one simple answer. And I'm going to get into it right now. A pro that you're going to want to consider whether or not you buy or rent in retirement is going to be whether or not you need to fund your retirement through the sale of your current home. So if, depending on the value of your property, let's use an example of, say you have $500,000 in equity, you're going to want to put that in some form of an investment vehicle that's going to pay you a dividend that's going to be able to cover your rent. And for argument's sake, an average rent in the Toronto area now for a one-bedroom apartment is about $2,000. So if that dividend can pay you out at $2,000 a month, maybe that's a good solution for you in terms of renting instead of buying, so that you have that principal to fund the majority of your retirement into the future. Another pro that I find a lot of clients consider whether or not they want to rent instead of buy is it comes from the aspect of responsibility. Just not having to own a home, have to worry about the maintenance on the home, insuring the home, some of the associated costs with that above and beyond your regular utility costs. That can sometimes deter people from wanting to own in retirement. They want to fund their retirement through the equity they have built in their home, and it really offers them a different lifestyle, because maybe they just want to travel extensively. They just want to close the door, lock it, and not have to think twice about their home. Let's look at a con when it comes to renting versus buying. And it really has to do with renting from the type of landlord, whether it be a corporate type landlord or a small time landlord. And the bigger risk when renting from a small time landlord, let's say like you or I, is there's always the threat of eviction. People's life changes, life happens, and if all of a sudden your landlord has to sell their property, that could displace you. And I'd like to give you a great example and share a story where I had a client come to me and they had rented a home for the better part of 40 years. Their market rent, what they were paying, was well below what the current rental market would be. And they had lived in this house for about 40 years. And that landlord was at a point in time in their life, they were selling the property. And the new owner purchasing the property was going to be taking the home for their own use to raise their family. And so that meant this couple was going to have to move. And it was quite scary for them, because now they're having to reevaluate when they go back into the real estate market. Can they afford to purchase? And if so, what type of property? The rental market, especially in the Greater Toronto area, has really skyrocketed. So their rent was going to be over triple what they were paying. And it was a really stressful time for them. And in the end, they did decide to purchase. We found them a small condominium apartment to purchase, but it is an example of one of the cons if you do decide to rent in retirement, is where do you live and who is the owner of that property that you're renting from. Another con to consider when you're looking at renting versus buying is going to be the control you have of the property. And it could be things like renovations, the color of paint you want the house to have internally. You may have a very specific color choice that makes you feel good and that you would like to have, but if the apartment or the house doesn't come in that color and you want to change it, well, you'd have to get written permission from a landlord. And I can tell you from experience, many landlords aren't willing to do this, whether it's an added expense. And they might sometimes say to you, okay, you do the labor and I'll pay for the material. So sometimes there is give and take, but the majority of landlords, from my experiences, they just prefer not to. So that's something that you have to consider, whether it's the gardens, maybe you want to have specific type of plants that's a hobby of yours. You may not have that flexibility, when you choose to rent versus owning your own property. And that's another thing that you're really going to have to evaluate as to how important that is to you when you're living in retirement. Another con could be rent increases. The variable costs annually, in the province of Ontario now as it stands, you're looking at up to 2.5% increase every calendar year. And, if you're living in a property that's newer than 2018, the landlords can then charge, they're not subject to the same rent controls. So they could actually bump their rent up to current market rents. So when you're living on a fixed income and you have to be considerate of those types of variable changes in terms of your cost of living, renting might be a bit of a con. Whereas when you own, hopefully you own the home outright with no mortgage, you have your same costs in terms of utilities to carry the property and property taxes. But I think if you do an equation where you look at your annual rent versus what are the property taxes and utility costs on a house, I think that's a good comparable to look at and determine what's better for you, whether or not you want to rent or purchase. I'd like to shift into some of the pros for purchasing a home when you're getting ready to retire or already retired. But first, I'd love to get some of your feedback. If you have any comments, whether you're renting or buying, I'd love to hear some of the positive aspects of why you've done it and why you enjoyed that, or even some of the negative ones on either side. I'd love to get your insights based on how you're currently living. So please comment below. And as we look into the ownership side of things, the one trend I think that comes to top of mind for me is stability. And I have clients that decide they want to purchase in retirement. They're looking to live in specific communities. Maybe they have health condition. Maybe their doctor is close by, and they've got their support network in a given community. They own in the home. They own their home, and they like that stability of that. When things change in their lives, at least home doesn't. And so for them, that provides a real sense of security and comfort, and it gives them happiness. So I think that's a big reason why a lot of people that I work with choose to buy in retirement, is that they want that stable environment. And I've got a wonderful family I worked with a few years back, and they were downsizing their home and they ended up buying a condo. And the reason they wanted that same stability is they were not just at the beginning of their retirement, but more in the middle. They were, in their late 70s, and the husband had some health conditions. And he just wanted the stability of the condo so that he knew in his heart and in his mind his wife was going to be well looked after. She was never going to have to worry about selling their house and relocating to a new community, and where would she consider moving. They had decided together where they would live at that point in time, and he just wanted to make sure she was very well taken care of. And thankfully to this day he's still living there with his wife, and they love living in their condo. And that's the one thing they report back to me when I do talk with them, is they just love the stable environment they've provided for one another. And it's in a condominium community that they're very, it's close to their church, it's close to their friends and their family, and they continue to live the lifestyle that they want to live in retirement. Another pro for home ownership could be choosing to live in a plus 55 or a retirement type community where you're living surrounded by like-minded people. And there's a real social component that might appeal to you. Sometimes when people stay in their house where they've raised their kids and their kids have moved out and moved on and have started to raise their own families, maybe they've left the community, or where they're living isn't as convenient to visit the parents. And because they've started their own lives with their children, it's just they see their family, but just not as regularly as they might otherwise have expected. And sometimes there's a sense of loneliness. So when they buy, or I find clients that buy into these types of properties where they're surrounded by like-minded people, maybe it's a golf course community, they do various activities and sports, lots of social things such as cards, they do day trips, and it's just real like a communal type of environment. And I find when I'm helping clients in that part of their life, there's a real sense of pride and independence that they're still living life to its fullest. And oftentimes when I talk to these people, clients of mine, I'll find that they're busier in retirement than when they were working in their career and raising a family. And they'll often say, I don't know how I ever managed doing all these other things when their life is so busy in the moment. And it's always a nice, gratifying feeling to see people enjoying their life. And so I think that's another real pro to purchasing in retirement. A third pro to consider when you want to purchase versus renting when you're about to retire is the growth of equity. And oftentimes when I meet with clients and we start to discuss what their needs are and really what they're looking to do, and I ask them some questions in terms of what their goals in life, in terms of where they're going to live are, they'll always say, I feel like I'm too old to own. And it's like they look at the home equity as that's the end of the road. They just think whatever they're going to buy, there's no possibility for any equity growth. And so what I want to say is that's not true. Obviously, we can never know which direction the market's going to go in, and really you can't time the market. So my conversation with people, depending on their financial wherewithal and what their goals are, I'll always say to them, make yourself at least an 8 to 10 year plan. And in that plan, and once you look at the finances, generally speaking, you will have built some form of equity in the house. It may not be the same level of equity you had in your prior house if you'd lived somewhere for 30 or 40 years. But if you can look at the next 10 years and say, I can afford this lifestyle, I can afford the home, I have enough retirement savings, and I'm going to live the lifestyle I want, then that's probably a good direction to go in. And I would love to share with you a great example of a client whose house we sold actually this past year. And his life was changing. He became widowed, unfortunately, and he was on his own. So there was a number of reasons to consider the move. And he was going to move into a community that's retirement living with assistance there. And so in order for us to make that affordable for him, we costed out what the cost of moving into this retirement community was. And it was about $60,000 a year. And we subsequently sold his house for $1.2 million. And so he knew that that was going to provide him at least 20 years of living, just from the proceeds of the sale of the house. So he had built all this equity in his home, and he was able to transfer that equity into his next phase of retirement. And he was a man in his late 70s. And when I talk to him now, he absolutely loves the community he moved into. He said he describes it as like living in a cruise ship. So there's a whole social component for him. A lot of the things around the house for him now and his meals, it's all looked after. So he really just has to go and enjoy his life. And the ironic part of it was he, not knowingly, he moved into this retirement facility, and there was a colleague from work through his career that's in the same facility, unbeknownst to him. So it ended up being a real positive that he was able to take this equity from his home, transfer it to his new retirement home, and he's happy. He's got a great lifestyle. He's got a whole social component to his life that he might not otherwise have experienced had he just stayed at home living by himself. And it's just a great example that your equity will continue to grow if you do buy into other properties, at least if you can do it long term. So it's just something to consider, and another pro for why it's important to have home ownership in retirement. Now I'd like to look at some of the cons that could take place with home ownership in retirement. And the first one that comes to my mind is the home maintenance. As we age, and depending on the size of your property and the amount of work that's required to maintain it, as well as the cost of that, once you're on a fixed income, you may not have the same financial freedom and disposable income to be doing all of the various requirements in order to maintain the level of your home that you've had throughout your life. So if the cost of maintenance gets too great, and then you're relying on family members, and other people have to be involved in taking care of your home, that could be a reason for why maybe renting something, depending on where you're at in your life, might be a better idea. Earlier this year, I sold a condominium of a client of mine, and one of the reasons that she sold and chose to go rent, or at least sell her property, was she was 95 years old. And even the condominium is low maintenance as it was. It was still a lot of work for her just to manage living on her own. And for her, what was really important was she wanted to sell her condo. She was going to move in with her daughter and live with her because her daughter could assist with her. And that was, what they had discussed as being the ideal situation for her to be in. We sold the condo and she was able to gift money to her grandchildren. And she was able to see them buy their first properties. And that really gave her a real good sense of pride. She was really proud. She was happy to be able to do that for them. Obviously, she had never envisioned ever being in that kind of position. She never thought her property would be worth that much money and she had that much equity. And getting to help her achieve that goal and see the pride that she had was really an awesome experience. And that's a really popular reason sometimes for why people want to go to sell their property and maybe rent or live with a family member. And that could be a con to owning for too long into retirement, is things just get to be a little bit too much for you to handle on your own. A third con could be loneliness. Oftentimes when people retire and as they get on to maybe their later years in retirement, and if they've lived in the same community for a long time, there may be turnover to where a lot of their friends from their social circle have left the area, and even their kids have grown up, become adults, and moved out into their own lives, and maybe they've left the city or the province, whatever the case may be, and now they feel like they're alone. So people may choose to sell their home and maybe not even buy something else, but live maybe in a retirement center where there's like-minded people, there's social components to living, there's more assistance with, doing your regular maintenance and cleaning of their apartments or their house, depending on the setup that they are living in. So that sometimes could create a con in terms of ownership. I guess the only caveat to that, what I have found, sometimes people, depending on where they're at what stage in life, they might choose to buy a recreation property because everyone loves going to the lake and there's always lots of fun things to do, being outdoors, creating family memories. So sometimes that's something that I find a client will choose to do, is buy, a cottage, we'll say, and the whole family can then enjoy it. And, as a person, looking at the multi-generations of family you've created and watching them all grow together could be a real sense of pride and gratification. So as much as it might be a con to own your primary residence, maybe having a recreation property is a nice compromise so that you still own something, but you get to enjoy it with your family. I'll see you on the next video where we dig into the cost of living during retirement.